The moment Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez looked across a brightly lit CNN set and snapped at Senator John Kennedy with a line about him being an old white man who doesn't understand the future, was the moment the debate stopped being about policy and started being about posture. I'm not claiming she said it exactly like that in real life, and I'm not asking anyone to take it as a transcript. I'm describing the kind of television moment that feels inevitable when confidence outruns preparation. Because if you've watched enough primetime politics, you know the trap. Somebody walks in thinking they're the main character, and somebody else shows up treating it like an exam. CNN billed the event as Green New Deal, future or fantasy, and the producers clearly wanted a generational clash that would break into clips before the second commercial. They positioned Ocasio-Cortez as the young avatar of bold progressive change, the star who could explain sweeping ideas in a way that would play on social media and make the opposition look dusty and out of touch. They also believed they'd booked the perfect foil. Senator John Kennedy, older, Southern, folksy, with that Louisiana drawl and the habit of talking about his mama and common sense, looked like the kind of guest producers assume will wander into cliches and hand the camera to the younger, sharper speaker. That assumption is a lazy habit in political media, and it's one of the reasons these shows keep stepping on rakes. Because Kennedy's public persona has always been part act, part tactic, and part truth. He can sound like a country lawyer while thinking like a courtroom strategist. And the part a lot of people forget, or never bother to learn, is that he's also unusually credentialed for someone who plays the aw shucks role so well, including serious academic training that signals he's comfortable in technical arguments. In this kind of hypothetical showdown, the mistake isn't that a young progressive criticizes an older conservative. The mistake is assuming an insult can substitute for an answer, especially when the other person came to ask questions that don't require ideology, just arithmetic. CNN wanted a platform for the Green New Deal, and they wanted Kennedy there as contrast, expecting heat without real danger. But what if Kennedy treated the night like a lawyer treats cross-examination, not like a politician chasing applause lines? What if he spent days collecting clips, reading position papers, checking numbers, and turning every loose phrase into a simple yes or no moment on live television? That's the uncomfortable truth about modern political celebrity. When you live on viral moments, you start believing the camera is your ally. The audience becomes a cheering section. The moderator becomes a traffic cop. And the other guest becomes the background scenery. Then someone shows up who doesn't care about your follower count and doesn't mind being called boring because boring is exactly how you smuggle in the knife. In this scenario, Jake Tapper opens the show with the usual framing about America's environmental and economic future, and Ocasio-Cortez sits forward like she's about to deliver the speech she's already practiced. Kennedy sits back, half smiling, as if he's watching a magician warm up before revealing the trick he's already figured out. Tapper gives Ocasio-Cortez the first word, and she does what she's built to do. She talks about climate change as an urgent crisis, about jobs, about justice, about how incremental steps are not enough, and she uses the kind of language that makes supporters feel seen. She pivots to the moral contrast, drawing a line between the future and the old guard, and the progressive side of the studio audience applauds on cue. Kennedy nods politely, the way a good witness nods before correcting the lawyer's assumptions. Then he speaks, and he doesn't sound angry, he sounds friendly, and that's what makes people underestimate him even harder. He calls her Congresswoman, compliments her passion, and says he's just a simple country lawyer who likes numbers because numbers don't care what your politics are. That line always plays, because it sounds humble, and makes the other person look like they're arguing from vibes. Then he introduces a visual gag, something like a comically large calculator, and the room laughs, which is exactly what he wants. Humor disarms the audience, but it also narrows the other person's options, because now any pushback risks looking humorless. And once the tone is set, Kennedy starts doing what cross-examiners do best. He asks questions so simple that the audience can judge the answer instantly. He brings up a prior comment about unemployment and multiple jobs, not to dunk, but to ask the mechanical question: do people count twice if they have two jobs? That's not a partisan question. It's a definitional one. And it forces the viewer into the role of referee. If Ocasio-Cortez tries to expand into a broader sociological point, Kennedy shrinks the frame back to the basic statistic. If she gets impatient, she looks evasive. If she answers incorrectly, she looks unprepared. If she says it was imprecise, she concedes the point. The real danger isn't any single misstatement. It's the feeling that the person selling a massive economic plan can't handle the first rung of the ladder. From there, the hypothetical Kennedy doesn't jump straight to ideology. He stays in the land of "how does this work?", which is where big plans start to wobble. He pivots to the Amazon HQ2 fight, because it's a story people remember. Jobs, incentives, headlines, and a company leaving amid political backlash. He frames the incentive debate as a basic distinction between spending money and not collecting money, and he repeats it slowly, like he's teaching a class. That's strategic, because when you teach, the other person can't easily accuse you of attacking, and the audience starts feeling like you're the adult in the room. If Ocasio-Cortez responds with moral language, corporate power, labor issues, exploitation, Kennedy doesn't debate the morality first. He asks about quantities, number of jobs, projected revenue, timeline, what happens when the deal disappears and the numbers go to zero. He uses the calculator again, not because he needs it, but because props make people remember the math. And here's where the tension rises, because the audience begins to sense a pattern. Every time she tries to move to the grand narrative, he drags her back to the spreadsheet. That's when a debate stops being a debate and becomes a demonstration. Next comes the big-ticket question that always haunts sweeping proposals: cost. Kennedy cites a large number, whether it's fair, inflated, contested, or debated, because the point isn't to prove it beyond dispute in a TV segment. The point is to force a funding explanation. He divides it by households. He turns it into a per-family figure. And suddenly the plan isn't a moral banner, it's a bill. And once a plan looks like a bill, viewers start asking, wait, who's? Which is the question political movements hate, because it's where coalitions fracture. Ocasio-Cortez can argue that cost estimates vary, that assumptions matter, that investments pay off, that comparisons to wartime mobilization are relevant. But Kennedy keeps the same tone. Okay, give me the mechanism. That's a brutal trap, because mechanisms are never as inspiring as slogans. If she goes broad, tax the rich, close loopholes, make corporations pay, Kennedy asks for the scale. He plays the simple man again and says something like, if we took all the money from every billionaire, what does that get us, and what's left? The audience doesn't need to love billionaires to understand subtraction. And if she refuses to accept the premise, she risks looking like she can't do the math. If she accepts it, she's stuck with a gap she can't fill in 2 minutes. The moderator tries to move on, but the show can't, because now the air smells like bloodless embarrassment, and TV producers know embarrassment is engagement. At this point, the hypothetical Kennedy doesn't need to call her names or question her motives. He can simply repeat, politely, that she has an economics background and should be able to explain basic funding. That kind of line is dangerous because it turns the debate into a competence test, and competence tests don't feel partisan. Viewers who like her start hoping she'll land a clean answer, and viewers who dislike her start savoring every pause. That's the worst position for any politician, being watched by supporters as a student and by critics as a target. When she starts to stumble, the room doesn't explode. It tightens because everyone senses the cliff edge. Then, to raise the drama, Kennedy pivots from policy to optics, not as an accusation, but as a question about consistency. He references the Met Gala dress, the tax the rich image, the broader debate about celebrity politics, and he asks whether it undermines the message or supports it. This is where he can land a joke without being cruel. Something about how he's never been to a party with that price tag and doesn't plan to start at his age. The audience laughs, and laughter is a verdict in television. Ocasio-Cortez can respond that visibility is leverage, that she was there to bring attention to the message, that politics is communication, and she'd be right, in a sense. But Kennedy's tactic is to make the viewer feel a disconnect, not to prove hypocrisy like a prosecutor, just to highlight the tension and let the audience do the judging. He introduces photos of a luxury building, designer items, a high-profile lifestyle snapshot, and he asks a simple question. Does this help or hurt the argument that the system is fundamentally broken? Notice what he doesn't do if he's careful. He doesn't claim wrongdoing. He doesn't claim illegal benefits. He doesn't accuse her of corruption. He stays in the realm of political narrative and perception, because perception is where campaigns actually live. And he pairs it with numbers again. Salary figures, median income figures, because numbers give a moral argument a hard edge. Ocasio-Cortez can argue credibly that a salary is public, that Washington is expensive, that this is a distraction from policy, but the audience is already hooked on the contrast the show has built. Then Kennedy slides into biography and identity, the place where modern politics gets messy fast. If he's smart, he doesn't attack her background. He asks about it because asking lets him imply without declaring. He brings up Yorktown Heights versus the Bronx, how narratives get simplified, how politicians talk about where they're from and what that phrase really means. He frames it as a question about authenticity, not as a claim of deceit, which is crucial if you're trying to keep the story in the lane of commentary rather than accusation. Ocasio-Cortez can respond that families move, identities are layered, from can mean culture and community rather than zip codes, and again, she wouldn't be crazy for saying it. But the danger is cumulative. In a single debate, if you've already looked shaky on definitions, funding, and mechanisms, the audience becomes less charitable when you answer philosophical questions. That's the psychology of live TV. Competence buys you grace, and uncertainty makes every answer sound like spin. The moderator tries to protect the format, but formats don't survive momentum. By now, Kennedy has turned the night into a series of small tests that the audience can grade in real time. And because the tests are small, each one feels fair, which is what makes the bigger collapse feel earned, even if the framing is selective. In this hypothetical version, Kennedy returns to legislative substance because that's the cleanest closing weapon. He asks what has passed, what has become law, what has survived committees, what has been enacted, and he contrasts the performative with the procedural. That's not a moral critique. It's a job performance critique, and those land harder because they don't require the viewer to share ideology. Ocasio-Cortez can point to shifts in discourse, to agenda setting, to movement building, to coalition pressure, and those are real forms of power. But in a debate framed as future or fantasy, The audience expects deliverables, and deliverables are easier to list when you've been in the Senate for years. Kennedy holds up his thick folder. She has a thinner one, and whether the comparison is fair or not, the visual does the arguing for him. At the end, Kennedy offers what looks like a friendly quiz, and that's when the room fully understands what happened. The quiz isn't for her, it's for the audience, because it gives them a sense of control and clarity in a topic that's usually abstract. How is unemployment calculated? What is a tax incentive? What's the funding mechanism? How do you reconcile ambition with feasibility? Ocasio-Cortez answers some, hesitates on others, reframes, returns to values, and the crowd reacts in waves. Kennedy smiles, nods, and repeats the same calm line. If you're going to rewire the economy, you should be able to explain the wiring. The closing statement, in this scenario, lands like a courtroom summation disguised as a grandfatherly chat. Kennedy praises her communication skills while warning that communication isn't governance. He says the country can't run on vibes, that math is stubborn, that trade-offs are real, that good intentions don't pay invoices. He doesn't call her evil. He doesn't claim she's committing crimes. He doesn't accuse her of anything legally charged. He questions whether her proposals are ready for prime time. Ocasio-Cortez looks for a way to flip it back into moral urgency, and she might even land a strong line about courage and crisis. But the energy has shifted. And that's when you get the part modern politics can't control. The clip economy. The debate becomes a highlight reel, and highlight reels don't preserve nuance. They preserve embarrassment and applause. Do the math becomes a meme. The calculator becomes a meme. The per household number becomes a meme. And the internet does what it always does. It turns complicated policy into a punchline. Supporters argue that the framing was unfair, that cost estimates are debated, that the Green New Deal is a resolution, not a full bill, that Kennedy cherry-picked examples, and those arguments may be valid. But television doesn't reward validity. It rewards clarity, and the person asking simple questions always looks clearer than the person explaining systems. Afterward, mainstream commentary splits into predictable camps, but the discomfort leaks through even friendly analysis. Some panelists say Kennedy won on presentation and pressure, not because he proved anything final, but because he forced her into short answers where long answers were required. Some say she tried to debate in moral language while he debated in mechanical language, and the show rewarded mechanics. Others point out that a debate doesn't determine policy truth, but it can determine political credibility. And credibility is a fragile asset. The most damning reactions aren't the hostile ones, they're the sympathetic ones that admit she didn't have clean answers on funding and scope. And in politics, didn't have clean answers is the kind of phrase that follows you like a shadow. In the long run, this kind of moment doesn't necessarily end careers, but it does change gravity. It invites primary challengers, it chills donors, it makes leadership more cautious, and it makes every future proposal face a harder first question. Can you explain the basics? Ocasio-Cortez could recover by tightening her policy explanation, by showing work, by building coalitions, by passing pieces of legislation, by proving she's more than a media figure. Kennedy, meanwhile, benefits from the persona that's hardest to counter, the guy who just asks questions because questions sound innocent even when they're strategically lethal. The larger lesson, for anyone watching, isn't that one side is good and the other is bad. It's that fame isn't fluency, and the camera doesn't forgive confusion. And if you demand the stage, you'd better be ready for someone else to use it like a chalkboard. And once the clip economy grabs something like that, The debate doesn't live in full sentences anymore. It lives in screenshots, in 15-second loops, in reaction faces, in the kind of chopped-up moment that makes everyone feel like they watched the whole thing, even if they didn't. By midnight, it's not Green New Deal, future, or fantasy, it's calculator guy versus viral congresswoman, because that's the version people can retell at work the next morning. That's also when the incentives of everyone involved start to change, because the story stops being about policy and starts being about damage control. And damage control has a way of making even smart people say dumb things, because everyone becomes obsessed with winning the next hour instead of the next month. CNN, in this scenario, tries to do what networks always do after a segment catches fire. It books follow-ups. They want a post-game panel. They want a fact-check. They want a body language expert. They want an economist who can translate the math without sounding like a scold. But the more you try to correct the narrative, the more you confirm there is a narrative to correct, which is how you end up pouring gasoline on the thing you're trying to extinguish. Producers ask for Ocasio-Cortez to come back the next night for a friendly sit-down, and her team has to decide whether that's an opportunity or a trap. Because returning too quickly can look like panic, but waiting too long lets the other side define the memory. Meanwhile, Kennedy doesn't have to do much at all. That's the part that drives opponents crazy. The less he says, the more confident he looks, because silence reads like control. If he goes on a victory tour, he risks looking like he came for humiliation instead of debate. And even viewers who agree with him might cringe at that. So the smarter move is the one he tends to prefer. Keep it folksy. Keep it minimal. Keep repeating the same line, "I just asked questions," until it becomes a shield you can't pierce. And if you think that's cynical, ask any trial lawyer what's more persuasive, a long argument or a short question that forces a bad answer. Ocasio-Cortez's challenge is different and, honestly, more complicated. Her brand, for years, has been built on moral urgency, clarity, and the ability to compress big ideas into sharp, shareable lines. That skill is real, and it's part of why she became influential so fast. But the same skill can become a liability when the conversation is forced into mechanics, because mechanics don't compress without losing something important. So now, she has to decide whether to lean into the moral frame harder or step into the mechanical frame and risk sounding like she's abandoning the very style that made her powerful. In the days after the debate, you can picture the internal meetings without even being in them. Comms people want a message that is simple, sharp, and repeatable. Something like, "He cherry-picked numbers," or "He's avoiding the climate crisis." Policy staff want nuance, footnotes, sources, and a clean explanation of why cost estimates vary and why a resolution isn't the same thing as a fully funded bill. The problem is that nuance doesn't travel, and footnotes don't trend. And when those two teams fight, the public usually sees it as inconsistency, which feeds the exact narrative you're trying to escape. That's how you get statements that feel like they were designed by committee, technically careful, but emotionally flat. Then come the opportunists, because politics always attracts people who can smell a moment. Some conservative influencers treat it like a trophy hunt and start selling merch with calculators and slogans, which is tacky but predictable. Some progressive influencers treat it like a conspiracy and insist the whole thing was scripted, which might feel comforting but usually doesn't persuade anyone outside the choir. Moderates, meanwhile, do what moderates always do. They start talking about seriousness, responsibility, and kitchen table issues, as if those phrases are magic spells. And it's right around here that the debate starts leaving the realm of policy entirely and drifting into the more dangerous territory of identity and status. Not because anyone needs it to, but because that's where the audience's emotions are easiest to manipulate. Here's what I mean. Supporters of Ocasio-Cortez don't just see her as a lawmaker. They see her as a symbol of generational change, of inclusion, of pushing against a smug establishment. Critics of Ocasio-Cortez don't just see her as wrong on policy. They see her as a stand-in for performative politics, for slogans without spreadsheets, for social media replacing substance. When those two symbolic interpretations collide, nobody is really arguing about the Green New Deal anymore. They're arguing about what kind of country they think they live in. And once you're in that symbolic arena, even a small stumble gets treated like evidence of something larger. That's why the stakes feel so high, even if the specific policy details remain unsettled. The next flashpoint in a story like this is usually the expert class piling on. Economists start writing threads, professors start doing explainers, commentators start grading the debate as if it's a midterm exam. Some of that is useful, but a lot of it comes off as condescending, which ironically helps Ocasio-Cortez with her base, because it reinforces the "they hate her because she's disruptive" storyline. At the same time, those critiques land with the broader audience because they sound neutral. I'm not political, I'm just explaining the math, even when the framing isn't perfectly neutral. So you end up with both sides feeling validated, which is a recipe for the story to last longer than it should. And the longer it lasts, the more it bleeds into everything else she says. That's also where the internal Democratic politics start getting weird. Leadership doesn't want a televised train wreck to define the party, especially not if it's going to be used as a shorthand attack in swing districts. B. So you get the classic Washington move. Quiet distance. Not open condemnation, not open support, just fewer invitations, fewer cosigns, fewer moments where leadership lets the camera linger on a shared stage. It's not personal, they'll say. It's strategic, which is Washington's favorite way to say, "We're calculating your cost." At this point, Ocasio-Cortez has two possible arcs, and both are risky. Arc 1 is to double down on the moral argument, treat the debate as a gimmick, and hammer the idea that the opposition wants to distract from climate urgency with parlor tricks. That can work short-term, because it rallies her people and turns the whole thing into a story about bad faith. But it also risks leaving the mechanical questions unanswered, which lets critics keep replaying the same clip with the same "where's the plan" framing. Arc 2 is to go full policy wonk, show her work, walk through funding levers, timelines, and trade-offs, and prove she can operate in detail without losing the human message. That can work long-term, but it's harder to make go viral, and it invites even more nitpicking from people who weren't going to be convinced anyway. The irony is that Kennedy's best weapon isn't his education or his resume. It's his ability to make the audience feel like they already know the right answer. He asks questions that turn viewers into co-prosecutors. Does that sound right to you? Can you afford that? Where does the money come from? When a viewer feels like they arrived at the conclusion themselves, it sticks harder than any argument you can deliver. And that's why it's so hard to reverse the momentum once it starts. It's not that one person won, it's that the audience was coached into a certain feeling and then rewarded for having it. So the real cliffhanger isn't whether a debate makes someone look good or bad for a week. It's whether the moment forces an evolution. Will Ocasio-Cortez treat it like a media injury and simply try to outmessage it, or will she treat it like a professional challenge and tighten the policy muscle that critics say is underdeveloped? Will Kennedy become the template for future Republican attacks? Humble tone, basic math, gentle smile? Or will voters eventually tire of gotcha by spreadsheet theatrics too? And what does it say about American politics if the most influential moments come not from legislation or governing, but from who looks confident under studio lights? If that's the future, then the question isn't just Green New Deal, future or fantasy, it's primetime democracy, leadership or performance. And that's where this story actually ends, not with a winner declared or a villain exposed, but with an uncomfortable mirror held up to modern politics. What played out on that stage wasn't really about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or John Kennedy as individuals, and it certainly wasn't a final verdict on any single policy idea. It was a reminder of how fragile authority becomes when performance outruns preparation. In an era where followers can be mistaken for fluency and applause can be confused with understanding, moments like this land harder than they should. The deeper question isn't whether bold ideas are good or bad, or whether folksy skepticism is wisdom or theater. It's whether we've trained ourselves to reward confidence more than clarity and branding more than mastery. Television compresses everything, and when it does, the person who can answer the simplest questions usually looks like the adult in the room, even if the bigger picture is far more complex. Politics will move on. It always does. New debates will replace this one, new faces will rise, and new clips will dominate feeds. But the lesson lingers quietly in the background. If you ask for the spotlight, you inherit the questions that come with it. And in the end, math doesn't care who's trending.